"Who do you think you are, talking back to a cop?" The officer grabbed the black woman's collar, yanked her out, and spat. "Where'd you steal this car from?" He thought it was just another show of power, but in a few minutes, he'd be the one on his knees. Because she wasn't just anyone. Watch till the end to see what happens when a police department realizes they just humiliated their new chief. Follow now so you don't miss the moment justice flips the script. The morning sky over the city was a dull gray. Old power poles stood silently, as if they had seen too many forgotten farewells. Adrienne, in a plain black shirt, drove her worn silver-gray sedan toward the police department she had studied for weeks. Her hand rested calmly on the steering wheel, fingers steady, eyes focused on each building and the chipped paint of the police department sign. Once shiny, the sign now looked faded and cold, its golden letters dulled by time and rain. She breathed deeply, slowly taking in the scene as if preparing for a ritual. Behind the rusty iron gate, patrol cars were scattered beside a corroded fence. A few officers stood laughing, their voices blending with street noise. Adrienne eased toward the gate, eyes still locked on the sign, silently reviewing faces from the files she had memorized the night before. Her car was blocked by a patrol SUV. A white officer stepped out, his uniform crisp, baton tapping sharply on her window. He didn't greet her or meet her eyes. Adrienne rolled down the window, met with a blank, careless stare. "Step out, papers," he ordered, his tone flat and commanding. In his eyes she saw disdain, a routine suspicion reserved for dark-skinned drivers in old cars. Without speaking, she calmly handed him her documents. Morning light broke through smog, casting patches on the pavement and the officer's boots, visible in her mirror. He flipped through the papers slowly, clearly searching for a reason to stall or challenge her. She noted every detail. The ink smudge on his hand, his careless manner as he returned the papers without a word, like a gatekeeper guarding something that was never his to own. The silence between them thickened. Far off, other officers glanced briefly before turning away. Adrienne knew this place wasn't built to welcome her. But she also knew this was only the beginning, and this inspection was just the first test in a long, tangled fight for control. Sunlight glinted off the windshield as Adrienne handed back her ID. The officer snatched it, brows furrowed in disappointment when all was in order. The card read only Adrienne M. Rowe with the city's seal, nothing to challenge, nothing to exploit. With a sneer, he tossed the papers through the window, scattering them. "This car? Where'd you steal it from?" The insult landed like a slap, filled with certainty and bias. Adrienne looked him in the eye. She didn't flinch. Sitting still, she gathered her papers, face unreadable, breath steady, unmoved by the hate in his voice. She knew what this was, and she knew it wouldn't end here. He needed no further excuse to turn a simple situation into a show of dominance. Without a single word of warning, the officer suddenly yanked the car door open, his coarse hand shooting forward to seize Adrienne's collar. The force of his pull jerked her body forward, her shoulders slamming into the car frame. She felt the fabric of her shirt clench into her skin, the heat of the pavement rise to the back of her neck, and the sharp cadence of his boots striking the concrete like a metronome of intimidation. His strength came not from physique, but from the habit of imposing it on those he saw as powerless, as outsiders, as default targets for every suspicious glance. "Get out!" he barked, each syllable ground between clenched teeth, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction as the woman in front of him lost her stance. He did not attempt to hide his smirk when the other officers in the distance glanced over and then looked away, pretending not to see. The entire department seemed to silently consent, like some cruel rite of passage for the newcomers, especially those who didn't fit the image most preferred to see. Adrienne slowly turned her head, straightened her back, and brushed off the hand still gripping her collar. The midday sun spilled across her face, revealing the fatigue of a long journey, but there was not a flicker of fear in her eyes. She stood facing him, shoulders squared, gaze locked on the arrogance burning in his. "Who do you think you are in this city?" he hissed, voice loaded with challenge as if determined to drown her in a crowd of indifferent strangers. The question hung in the air, not meant to be answered. It was a trap he had used countless times on those outside his system, a declaration of petty power masked as law enforcement. He stood there with one hand still clamped around her elbow, the other resting on his belt, as though to assert that every inch of the space around them belonged to him. Adrian did not flinch, nor did she glance at anyone else. Her eyes remained fixed on his every move, as if recording it all, not missing a single twitch. There was no anger, no shame, only a cold, precise observation that unsettled the man before her. In the glaring sunlight, their shadows stretched long across the pavement, interwoven with the shadow of the iron gate, an omen of the simmering standoff that had only just begun. In the distance, scattered laughter echoed, and uniforms blurred past the glass. No one stopping. Each step Adrian took away from the car was firm and silent, like a somber note in a stifling summer requiem. The officer had yet to realize that this very moment would become the fracture from which the crumbling order of his aging precinct would never recover. The main hall of the police station was always crowded at the start of the afternoon shift, but Adrian's entrance instantly drew every eye. The sound of the glass door clicking open was clear, followed by the stomp of leather shoes on the worn tiles. The officer who had dragged her from the car could not hide his smugness, nudging Adrian's shoulder toward a cluster of colleagues gathered around the front desk. The group quickly parted, but each turned to stare, their eyes filled with curiosity, suspicion, and a certain twisted delight. Chuckles echoed from the end of the corridor, whispers flying like poisoned darts aimed at the newcomer. A blond male officer leaned back against the wall, clapped mockingly, then shouted, "Another rookie Barbie!" That line became the cue for a chorus of laughter, with no one bothering to mask their judgment. Adrienne scanned the room. Every face bore a different shade of glee, from sneers curling at the corners of mouths to open grins of those used to standing above moral line. A petite young female officer appeared uneasy but stayed silent, pressed against the wall, eyes flicking to Adrian before quickly dropping when she caught the glare of an older male colleague. The air was thick with stale coffee and cigarette smoke, every comment deliberately pressing Adrian further into the shadows of the room. Still, she walked slowly, upright, not showing the slightest hint of weakness, even as each of her steps made the floorboards tremble with the weight of cheap gossip. The shift supervisor, his weathered face showing years of hardened attitude, leaned against the front desk, arms crossed, watching like he was sizing up a disorderly case. His contempt was unhidden, eyes scanning her from head to toe, as if stripping down every imagined flaw. He narrowed his eyes, curled his lip, and spoke in a flat, deliberate tone. "Someone like you is better off cleaning up after the night shift." The words struck with calculated insult, both personally demeaning and a clear line-drawing tactic from him and the veteran officers who ruled this space. Laughter rose again from the hallway, a warped chorus of discrimination. Some pretended indifference, but their eyes glinted with petty pleasure as the scene unfolded. Adrian stood facing the supervisor, neither retreating nor searching the room for support. She simply held her ground against his challenging stare. Drawing a breath, her face remained still, her eyes glowing with an unwavering spark. The scene, with its sneers, mocking voices, and cold stares, resembled a cruel initiation ritual for an outsider. In that moment, Adrienne felt the walls built long before she arrived, a silent structure of prejudice, power habits, and the complicit quiet of the majority. She knew that each step taken, each word absorbed, would etch itself into memory as part of the power game one had to endure to survive and change this place. The corner of the reception room still echoed with scattered laughter, the clicking of keyboards mingling with the hurried thuds of boots on worn tile. Adrienne stood in the middle of the lobby, her back seemingly dividing the small room. Behind her, a cluster of officers chatting idly. In front, the reception desk, where a young female officer sat on shift, visibly uneasy. The girl, with neatly tied brown hair and a petite frame, had just begun to smile in greeting when a tall male colleague nudged her shoulder, muttering low, but loud enough for all to hear, "Trying to be everybody's mother now?" The young woman's smile froze halfway. Her wide eyes dropped, and the hand that had started to raise in greeting quickly withdrew, disappearing into a stack of files. Adrienne caught that look, an instant of shared discomfort, a mix of empathy, shame, and helplessness, enough to realize that even kindness in this place was punished. The young officer busied herself with the papers, but her shoulders trembled slightly whenever mocking laughter rang out from behind. In that fleeting moment, Adrienne saw the entire system of power etched into every glance and word, where any act of help became an act of defiance. The air in the lobby thickened with unspoken jabs, layered between the sound of doors opening and closing and the crackle of the radio announcing the new shift. "Putting on a show? You'll never fit in here," a voice called out from a desk in the back, barely audible over the clink of a coffee mug against wood. No one dared meet Adrienne's gaze directly, but none hesitated to mock her behind her back, as if the presence of a black woman here was suspicious enough to warrant quiet warnings among themselves. An older officer with graying beard stubble, chewing noisily on a sandwich as he ended his shift, jerked his chin toward Adrienne and said, "Why are you still standing there? Go clean the storage room or something." The others around him chuckled, their eyes scanning her like they were waiting for a misstep, eager to pounce. In that tight circle, every word carried a hint of petty power, its strength rooted in silent agreement, the ability to turn someone into a collective target for their group frustrations. Adrienne remained still, her slender figure upright, her gaze calm and unwavering. She slowly lifted her head, letting her eyes move across each face in the room, pausing briefly on the hesitant look of the young woman, then settling on the group of men posturing at the end of the hall. There was no plea, no concession in her expression, only a composed, icy calm, as though she could read every unspoken thought in the room and saw no need to pretend otherwise. Her indifference disrupted the rhythm of the room. Conversations stalled in mid-sentence, and a few people looked away. Perhaps they had expected weakness or fury, some excuse to strike again, but her quiet composure only made the dividing lines sharper. In that moment, Adrienne knew she had stepped into a battlefield, where everyone understood the rules, only no one had ever dared break them. She drew in a deep breath, absorbing the scent of old wood, ink, faded paint, mingled with sweat and a trace of cigarette smoke clinging to their uniforms. Every eye focused on her, no one spoke, yet mockery still hung thick in the air. Adrienne stared directly at the shift commander, her gaze so firm that he instinctively turned away, leaving behind an oppressive silence. Her first test ended without a scratch, but the mark it left would follow her down every corridor ahead, a silent reminder of the invisible line she had just crossed, into a world where even a smile could become a target for collective punishment. And behind Adrienne's composed stare, no one could predict the undercurrents quietly building beneath that silence. The afternoon break room laid bare every habit in its rawest form: torn plastic chairs, coffee-stained tabletops, and pale yellow light filtering through dust-covered windows made the space feel all the more claustrophobic. Adrienne stepped in and had not even sat down when a cold sandwich landed with a thud on the table right in front of her. Laughter burst out. The crinkle of the sandwich wrapper sounded dry and sharp, followed by a half-used bottle of water with faded lipstick marks floating on its surface. A tall, broad-shouldered male officer in his 40s, hair buzzed short and eyes always gleaming with superiority, pushed the bottle toward Adrienne and chuckled. "Welcome gift for the newbie. Don't say we're not polite." The others joined in instantly, raising beer cans or slapping each other on the back, as if bestowing a favor no one dared refuse. The atmosphere was thick with pretense, a blend of veiled threat and a challenge to the dignity of anyone who dared consider themselves an outsider among a crew long bonded by unspoken rules and prejudice. Adrienne neither reached for the sandwich nor pushed the bottle aside. Her eyes remained fixed on the window, watching the fading streaks of daylight crawl across the parked police cruisers outside. A brief moment of uneasy silence passed, but it was shattered by the screech of a chair and the sharp jab of a joke from a white officer seated across the table. Raising his beer, he jerked his chin at Adrienne and sneered, "Heard this city's short on street sweepers. Why waste a spot in the force?" The words slashed at her pride, laced with discrimination and a clear intent to shove her to the fringes as quickly as possible. The room erupted in cheers, finger snaps, and the clang of beer cans hitting the table, blending into a worn-out anthem of mockery that everyone seemed to know by heart. Adrienne's eyes slowly passed over each face, recognizing the fake excitement and glints of satisfaction hiding behind their smirks. Some drained their drinks and looked away. Others folded their arms, applauding the ridicule with a mix of approval and smug detachment. By the window, a younger, lean officer subtly twisted a ring on his finger, eyes flickering with hesitation but saying nothing. The air thickened with the scent of old leather, leftover smoke, cold cuts, and tap water. Adrienne inhaled deeply, taking in every jab and whisper while keeping her expression completely composed, frustrating those who had expected a visible reaction. On the table, the limp sandwich sat next to the discarded water like a symbol of every false welcome this place had to offer. Every word, every glance, every burst of forced laughter aimed to test the limits of her endurance, to see if she would crack under this sugary-coated initiation. Adrienne didn't bite. She calmly adjusted her collar, pulled out her chair, sat upright, hands on the table, eyes locked once more on the ringleaders. The silence seemed to unnerve the room. The white officer who had just hurled an insult laughed out loud, but his tone lacked the certainty it had moments before. He turned to his colleagues looking for backup, but in that brief pause, Adrienne had already redrawn the boundary, turning the cruel joke into a test of character for the entire room, not just for herself. The laughter burst out like a rip through air already heavy with cynicism. It was not laughter of amusement, but a warped, smug sound, the kind of laugh that comes from those perched above enjoying the sight of someone being shoved below. The eyes in the break room no longer avoided her. They sliced through Adrienne as if trying to strip the skin off her back. Some nodded, some whistled, and one even lifted a phone to record, not bothering to conceal the intent. A beer can clattered loudly against the edge of the table, tipping a half-empty glass that spilled water across an old newspaper taped beneath it, the ink smudging into mottled streaks. No one reached out to wipe it. They just stared at Adrienne with a kind of cruel anticipation, as if waiting for her to break, to prove she didn't have the spine to last beyond the public lobby and dimly lit neighborhood. Adrienne sat still for a few seconds, then reached for the cold piece of bread placed in front of her. Heads tilted slightly her way, eyes predatory, eager to pounce at the first sign of discomfort or fury. But that expectation crumbled the moment she stood, calmly set the bread back on the table, and never looked away from the grinning faces. Her movement was not rushed. Instead, it carried a quiet decisiveness that made the room pause, like a foot lifted off the gas. "Thank you," Adrienne said, her voice clear, steady, neither loud nor heavy, but each word sank into the dense air like steel nails. "I'm not hungry, but maybe you should revisit your Pride menu." Every syllable lingered in the cramped space, making the rickety ceiling fan's clicking seem unusually sharp. Her words stunned the ones who thought they held the upper hand. A few exchanged glances, someone cleared their throat, and there was even a soft exhale from those suddenly realizing Adrienne was not like other rookies they'd run off before. One officer sitting closest clicked his tongue and feigned indifference, but under the table his hands clasped tightly, palms sweating. Adrienne needed no one to speak for her. Her direct, composed confrontation unsettled the entire room. No one said another word, no second laugh followed. The piece of bread remained where she left it, the wrapper slightly askew from her brief touch, like an unaccepted offering properly returned. The group that had roared like they were at a comedy club now quietly returned to their beers, their newspapers, their phones with screens dimmed, only their eyes didn't seem to know where to land. A soft breeze slipped in through the cracked window at the back of the room, stirring the frayed edge of a gray curtain. Adrienne placed a hand on the chair, retrieved the small backpack tucked under the table, and left her seat. Her posture was straight, her steps measured but not slow, walking toward the door like someone who had just wrapped up an uninvited gathering and still managed to leave the hosts uneasy. The door creaked open with little force, but the hinge screamed, carving a line between pretense and the truth now laid bare. A few turned their faces away, others rummaged in shirt pockets or food containers, acting as though avoiding her gaze could erase their part in the scene that had just unfolded. But her words would echo in their minds like a deep scratch across glass that no one dared polish clean. Adrienne left behind no sign of rage, no need for victory. The only thing she left was a room full of people who had lost control, not of her, but of the illusion that they still dictated who belonged and who didn't. The second-floor meeting room sat adjacent to the administrative offices, with soundproof walls, a low ceiling, and harsh white lighting casting down on a long wooden table scarred by years of internal briefings. The Monday meeting had no official memo, but everyone knew what would happen if they failed to show up. All seats were filled, and the air was thick with sweat, cigarettes, and stale coffee. The shift commander, a man in his 50s with a bulging stomach, tapped his pen sharply on the table without looking up, instantly silencing the room. He sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, deep-set eyes shaded beneath thick gray brows, slowly locking his gaze on Adrienne. His voice cracked out like dry wind in a nighttime corridor. Here, the ones who come late listen to the ones who came first. If you're black, stay silent. If you're new, keep your head down. These were not instructions, nor warnings. They were declarations of power, repeated so often they had become the station's unwritten creed. No one responded. A few nodded faintly, as if affirming what was already known, while others kept their eyes on their notebooks or stared fixedly at their fingernails, pretending not to hear. Adrienne sat at the end of the table, unintroduced, without a nameplate, ignored. She quietly opened her notebook and copied the words verbatim as if documenting a file for the record. Her handwriting was neat and small, quiet enough that no one could hear the pen on paper. Right after the meeting, the duty roster was updated. Adrienne saw her name listed for 5 consecutive days in the city's highest-risk zones: the abandoned construction site, the Northern Edge slum, and the intersection where 3 shootings had occurred in 1 month. Each shift landed at the worst times of day, periods prone to chaos and high assault risk, with virtually no backup. When she checked her assigned support officers, most entries were blank or paired with names known for last-minute call-outs or habitual absence. When Adrienne asked HR about the scheduling, she received only a cold smile and a vague answer that the system auto-assigns based on recorded performance. But she knew better than anyone. That system was manually operated, with every change requiring approval from the shift commander himself. Other new hires, mostly white men who started at the same time, were given light shifts, daytime hours, or paired with senior officers. The contrast was as stark as a blackboard beside a whiteboard. No explanation necessary. Adrienne logged it all in a private journal. Every name, shift time, and anomaly in the duty codes. At each post, something was always missing: a faulty radio, a patrol car marked broken but still assigned, an outdated map. She didn't complain or ask for swaps. Instead, she tested each device herself, printed backup maps, and annotated key points into her sleeve. That quiet preparation began earning a few glances of respect, but most still kept their distance, as if waiting to see her trip. They believed that isolating Adrienne would force her to quit or make mistakes, but they forgot some people don't enter the system to be accepted. Some enter to prove that the whole structure is already rotting. When she closed her notebook and stared at the 5th consecutive shift in a danger zone, she knew the game they set had finally met a player ready to answer. As she walked toward the parking lot after the meeting, Adrienne passed a group of officers lounging on the stone steps, smoking and chatting casually. Their faces were slick with sweat, top buttons undone, the air filled with smoke and cold coffee. One of them, tall with a gravelly voice, suddenly called out, loud enough for all to hear, "If she makes it through a week here, I'll bow down and call her boss." The remark wasn't meant as a personal challenge. It felt more like a collective bet, followed by drawn-out whistles, exaggerated gasps, and fake, encouraging shoulder taps. The officer's name was Dawson. He had been with the department for nearly 8 years, not known for competence, but popular for his quick tongue and his knack for securing a place through tricks and social maneuver. He looked at Adrienne with a half-joking, half-calculating stare, a cigarette resting between his fingers, and a crooked smile tugging at one side of his mouth. Adrienne didn't stop. Her shoes tapped steadily against the gray tile floor, and she only turned her head slightly as she passed where they sat. "All right," she said, her voice calm, neither slow nor hurried. "I'll make sure you remember that promise." Through the new assignment log. The reply wasn't loud, but it landed like a declaration branded into concrete with hot iron. The ones standing nearby instinctively glanced at one another, their expressions briefly unsettled, like they had just heard a wrong note in a song they thought they knew by heart. Dawson squinted, his face losing the smug ease it carried just seconds earlier. He didn't respond, only exhaled a thick stream of smoke and watched Adrienne descend the front steps, her upright posture a wordless challenge. He had never been checked that swiftly and directly by a newcomer, especially not by a black woman. The mood among the officers shifted. The room's earlier energy faded, replaced by awkward chuckles and a few half-hearted attempts to change the subject. Adrienne made her way toward the patrol car assigned for her upcoming shift, the same run-down vehicle everyone else avoided because of a faulty radio and a navigation system that frequently malfunctioned. She opened the door, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine, which sputtered noisily. Her fingers flipped through a small notebook she had marked the night before, detailing shift assignments, supervisors' names, and last-minute adjustments. In the final box of today's page, she added a short, unmistakable note. Dawson made a promise. Follow up in 1 week. She gently closed the notebook and tucked it into her inner jacket pocket. Sunlight slanted through the windshield, glinting off the edge of her eye and revealing faint streaks of dust across the dashboard. Without needing to glance back, she could still feel the distant stares lingering behind her, though their silence now held more weight than it had that morning. She didn't need to shout or prove anything. A quiet reminder, a timely reply, was enough to shift the tone in a department long used to its supremacy, and Adrienne understood that every word she spoke from now on would be a seed planted in the hardest soil, the kind that only grows into real change when tended by those strong enough to outlast resistance. News of the missing property from the evidence room spread quickly overnight. A firearm was reported missing, along with several sealed evidence bags that vanished from shelf number 12. There were no signs of forced entry, and the security footage showed a thin woman, hair tied back, wearing what looked like a patrol uniform, entering past midnight and leaving about 10 minutes later. The image was blurry, the lighting poor, and the face unclear, but the footage was labeled urgent and forwarded to the Internal Oversight Unit with a short note. Suspect may be Officer Adrienne Rowe. Before she could report for the morning shift, Adrienne was summoned to the 3rd floor, where the interrogation office for internal sensitive cases was located. The small room had pale gray walls, frosted glass, and a cold steel table. The atmosphere was quiet but suffocating, the kind of place that needed no threats because everything was designed to make anyone feel trapped in a blurred zone between guilt and innocence. 3 men were already seated inside, one in an inspector uniform, the others senior officers in charge of evidence management. As Adrienne entered, the door shut behind her with a dry click. No waiting chair, no introductions, just immediate scrutiny as her foot crossed the threshold. Papers were already spread on the table. The monitor displayed a black and white still of the moment the suspect appeared. Every detail was meticulously arranged. The angle chosen to highlight the woman's dark hair and height matching Adrienne. The footage paused at the moment the figure turned away, leaving only a vague shadow, enough to plant doubt. "Do you have anything to explain?" the inspector asked, voice flat and dry like a script. Adrienne didn't reply immediately. She stared at the screen, quietly analyzing every frame, every flicker of light, every grain of distortion. She watched the full 10-minute footage in silence, not because she refused to respond, but because she knew she was standing in the middle of a setup crafted by someone confident it would break her. Every gaze in the room clung to her, dissecting each move she made, the way she folded her arms, how she glanced at the edge of the table, everything treated like a crack waiting to widen. A female officer to the right quietly underlined a line in the report. Uncooperative. Adrienne noticed it, but her tone remained calm. If everything is this prepared, maybe I should start by asking who was in charge of storage system checks over the past 3 days? The question made the man in the center pause. He looked at his colleagues, lips pressed tight. Adrienne stepped slowly toward the table, didn't sit, and placed her hand on the steel edge, her eyes locking with the highest-ranking officer. I were the one who took it. Why show up exactly when the cameras were on? And if this tape is real evidence, why summon me before checking for fingerprints on site? Her counterattack came sharp and without need for volume, slicing through their pressure. For a brief moment, no one answered. The once cold stares fell into defensive silence, waiting for someone else to speak. Adrienne stood firm, face calm but unmistakably determined. Not someone to be broken by a grainy video and rehearsed accusations. She had seen this movie before, and this time she came to demand answers, not just endure questioning. As the interrogation room door closed behind her, whispers exploded in the hallway. Word that she had been called to the 3rd floor spread quickly down the stairs, into the control room, and across the administrative wing. The eyes that once hesitated now gleamed with certainty, as if everyone had anticipated this moment. Some no longer bothered to hide their delight. They believed the crack had formed, and with enough pressure, the shell of confidence around her would shatter, like those who once tried to change this place. On the stairwell leading to the 1st floor, an old cop lit a fresh cigarette, leaning against the railing, his eyes sunk deep beneath a wrinkled brow. He had been here more than 20 years, survived through 3 administrations, leaving little behind except the skill of staying alive. Watching Adrienne exit, he sneered, his voice loud enough to carry into the dead-quiet corridor. One stain's all it takes. People like you don't get a second chance. The statement wasn't a threat. It was a sentence delivered before any accusation, a broadcast to the silent crowd still afraid to speak, and a reminder that the unspoken rules of this place always knew how to pull someone down. He emphasized the words "someone like you" as if Adrienne had been born destined to be excluded from the system. Whether she stole something didn't matter. Just a rumor, a video, a scrutinizing glance at the right moment, and that was enough. Adrienne stopped and turned toward him. Her steps weren't rushed, but the echo of her shoes on the stone floor rang out sharp and steady, forming a cold rhythm. She stood facing him, her gaze as direct as a blade that didn't need sharpening. Just placing it down was enough to cut. A long silence stretched between them, the whole hallway seeming to contract, and then her voice rose, low, crisp, and hard as stone. If you like playing dirty, don't be surprised when someone clears the board. No one waited for a reply. Those nearby turned away, some stifled laughter, some clicked their tongues, others looked down at their watches as if they had suddenly become too busy to care. But no one denied that her words had shifted the wind. The old officer remained where he stood, his cigarette still unlit, staring at Adrienne with an expression difficult to name, part anger, part confusion, part caution. Adrienne didn't pause. She turned and walked away, her back as straight as the line drawn down the hallway. Each step closed a door behind her, not with noise, but with intent. Outside, the sound of a radio drifted in from the control room, blending with the breeze slipping through the window slats at the far end of the corridor. The atmosphere felt different, not simply quieter, but taut with a new kind of anticipation, as if everyone sensed a fresh battle had begun, not with ranks or fists, but with persistence and steel-edged clarity. At the far end of the hall, a young officer quietly made notes in the duty log, occasionally glancing toward where Adrienne had just walked. He said nothing, but his pen hovered a moment longer than usual, his gaze carrying a hint of respect. Some people, even when buried in suspicion, walk straight through without waiting to be pulled up, and from that moment, the entire third floor was no longer just administrative space. It became the first crack in the mask this place had worn for far too long. Adrienne knew she hadn't won, but she had just made those who believed themselves invincible reconsider where their pieces stood on the board. That night's shift swap seemed like a simple adjustment, just a change between two names on the duty roster. On paper, Adrienne was still listed first, but the final assignment moved her to a different area, and the route she had initially been given fell into the hands of a young female officer with less than 8 months of service. Her name was Ellie, petite frame, bright eyes, and always trying to smile in a place where optimism felt like a luxury. The incident occurred at 3:00 a.m. Ellie was dispatched to an abandoned warehouse after a reported break-in. She had no backup, weak radio signals, and the location had already been flagged in Adrienne's notes as high risk. By the time the ambulance arrived, Ellie had sustained serious injuries from a run-in with an armed group. Her abdomen was torn badly after hitting a rusted metal shelf while trying to flee. News returned to the precinct before sunrise, but what stirred attention was not the fact that the girl nearly died. It was the question of who was originally meant to be there instead. Adrienne arrived at the hospital at 6:00 a.m. She brought a small bouquet, plainly wrapped, and placed it on the tablecloth beside the hospital bed, then sat outside the intensive care unit. Ellie had passed the critical stage. Doctors said she could talk again in a few days, but no one knew if her mind would be strong enough to return to duty. Adrienne sat silently in the hallway, reeking of antiseptics, staring at the frosted glass door, still unsettled by the question, why was the shift changed, and who made that call? Not everyone was pleased to see Adrienne at the hospital. Just as she stepped out of the waiting area, a group of officers arrived, some carrying snacks, others tossing casual remarks and laughing as if nothing serious had happened. One of them, a man in his 40s with grease-stained sleeves, glanced at Adrienne with a mocking smirk and let out a low jab. "Scared you'll get blamed? Or worried about losing your spot so you had to show up yourself?" The comment wasn't loud, but it drew attention. Adrienne didn't respond immediately. She looked directly at him, her eyes lit, not with anger, but with the unmistakable clarity of someone who had heard this kind of thing before. What took people aback wasn't the stare, but what followed. Silence. Then Adrienne calmly replied, her voice no louder than usual, "I came because someone almost died covering my shift. What about you? Here to play a guest role?" The man froze. The semi-serious, half-joking energy of the group vanished instantly. Every eye turned to Adrienne, and this time, they were no longer laced with prejudice. Some lowered their gaze. Others stepped back, giving her space like they were afraid of being caught too close to something they had long avoided, the consequences of their silence. Adrienne turned and walked toward the elevator, each step echoing like an unspoken indictment in the hallway that still carried traces of blood and antiseptic. The following morning's briefing had an unusual heaviness. The room, typically filled with dry jokes and sarcastic remarks, now felt thick with quiet. Attendees avoided eye contact, adjusted sleeves, flipped notebooks, or feigned attention to their phones. On the back screen, the overnight duty list appeared as usual, but this time, the line with Ellie Sanders and the West Warehouse District Code stood out more clearly than in any meeting before. Adrienne stood up just minutes into the session. She didn't circle or wait for permission. Her voice rang out, steady and clear enough to make everyone feel as if their names were being called directly. "I just want to ask one simple question, right here in front of all of us." She stepped forward 2 paces, eyes fixed on the shift supervisor's desk, then slowly scanned the room. Who assigned Ellie Sanders to that night shift? Question dropped, and no one answered. The person closest to the scheduling chart clenched a pen so tightly that his knuckles whitened. The supervisor lifted his cup, but didn't drink. Some exchanged glances, only to look back down at their calendars, like they were double-checking. Not a single word came out. The silence itself became the clearest response. Everyone knew that the reassignment hadn't been a mistake, nor a coincidence, but to admit it in front of Adrian was to accept responsibility, and no one wanted their name recorded in the file from that day. Adrian did not appear surprised. She had anticipated this silence, but waited anyway. Waited so they could all feel the moral void each person in the room had helped to deepen. After a few seconds with no response, she pulled out her phone and calmly opened the recording app. The soft tapping of her finger on the screen echoed through the room like a knock jolting a sleepy conscience awake. "This morning's meeting will be recorded," she said, her tone steady as ever, not to trace who was wrong first, but so we'll remember who stood still when it was time to speak. The eyes that had turned away now looked back at her, none of them able to mask their discomfort. Someone seemed ready to respond, but it was only a scattered cough or two, followed by more silence. Adrienne closed the phone, slipped it into her jacket pocket, and stepped back to her original position. Before sitting down, she left behind a short sentence, like a blade slicing through years of dust on the dispatch desk. "Justice begins with those who know when to stay silent and dare to speak when it counts." No applause followed, no objections, but the atmosphere had shifted. The silence was not submission. It was the quiet that follows when, for the first time, someone stands in the middle of the room and says what no one else has dared to name. At the far end of the table, a young officer, only a few months into the job, gave a subtle nod. No one noticed, but Adrienne did, and to her, that single nod was enough to know this battle had found its second fighter, even if the words hadn't yet been spoken. The internal evaluation list was posted on the bulletin board early in the morning. Once a month, the command staff organized physical readiness drills for recruits or officers who had recently been subject to complaints, supposedly to assess emergency response capacity. In reality, everyone in the precinct knew it was a veiled purge mechanism, where those out of favor would be slowly pushed out through unfair testing, designed to ensure failure from the start. Adrian's name appeared last on the list, marked in red ink and underlined 3 times. Beside her name was a special label, Advanced Scenario Voluntary. The phrase sounded optional, but here it meant mandatory. Anyone who declined would be marked in their file, disqualified from promotions, or assigned to the lowest tier duties across the system. Adrienne didn't ask, nor did she object. She arrived at the training yard on time, wearing standard gear, hair tied neatly, a 30-kilogram pack strapped to her back as required. No one briefed her. Everything had already been set. The yard was unusually crowded that day. Aside from the officers assigned to supervise, several people from administrative departments also came out to watch, coffee in hand or leaning against barriers. Their faces showed no concern, but curiosity and anticipation. They had seen others who didn't fit the culture get dropped during round 1. One slip, one slow move, or even a misstep due to unfamiliar terrain was enough to label someone non-compliant and strike them from the process altogether. The test began with obstacle runs, vaulting over steel fences, crawling under wire, and sprinting while carrying a weighted dummy. Adrienne completed each task without asking for clarification. Her movements were sharp, every action executed per training standards. No flair, just efficiency. Sweat collected along her neckline, soaked into her collar, but her gaze never wavered from the course. She didn't stop mid-run, didn't turn around, and didn't seek eye contact from anyone. When it came to the second phase, rope climbing and balancing across a narrow wooden bridge, a bulky officer approached, still wearing gloves and a low-brimmed hat. He leaned close to Adrienne's ear, voice low and laced with challenge. "Slip once, and you're out of here." His breath carried stale coffee and cigarette smoke, veiled against her cheek like a private insult, veiled as a dare. She turned her head for a moment, not with defiance, but with the calm of someone who had seen it all coming. His words didn't shake her. If anything changed, it was her stride, firmer as she approached the wooden bridge, each creak beneath her feet accounted for in advance. The yard went still for a second, as spectators began to realize Adrienne hadn't come to bargain, nor to rely on luck. She was turning each stage into a declaration of competence, something they weren't prepared to acknowledge. And at the far end of that narrow bridge, the first to lower their heads weren't those in motion, but the ones who thought a fall was just a matter of time. Dust from the yard clung to her boots, her back darkened with sweat, but every stride remained consistent, each movement so precise that not even technical flaws could be found. At the rope-climbing station, the sun beat down on steel fibers, causing many to hesitate. Adrienne, however, gripped each knot, tightened her hold, and pulled herself up as if she had long been familiar with resistance. The repeated shoulder thrusts placed strain on her spine, yet instead of slowing down, she adjusted, using her knees and heels to secure balance points, cutting her climb time without outside aid. From the sidelines, no one offered encouragement, but many watched with growing discomfort. Adrienne wasn't just passing a test. She was dismantling a system designed to break her. Each move, each breath, served as silent proof that she wouldn't be discarded easily. By the time she reached the top of the incline, those who had once stood confident in her failure now exchanged glances, silently acknowledging the one truth they had tried to ignore. She wasn't here to be tested. She was here to survive and to force them all to witness it. The chatter from those watching below had faded. A few began to nudge each other with quiet reminders, and the once indifferent glances shifted toward guarded attentiveness. Adrienne faced her next obstacle, a sequence of high-bar rungs arranged like a horizontal ladder, with fluid, unbroken movement, her body steady and controlled. Each time her hand gripped the next bar, the muscles and tendons in her arms tightened visibly, but her strength never wavered. By the time her feet touched the ground at the end of the course, a smattering of applause broke out, then quickly faded, as if those clapping weren't sure whether to celebrate or be concerned. The final part of the assessment involved navigating a simulated explosion site, where participants had to carry a dummy victim from the center to a designated safe zone within 5 minutes. Unlike the previous exercises, this one replicated a real scenario, complete with rescue sirens, artificial smoke, and unexpected obstacles along the route. Adrienne didn't rush. She moved with precision, using her knees to lift the nearly 65-pound dummy, her hands firmly supporting the neck and shoulders by advanced training protocol. She didn't avoid the obstacles. She pushed them aside gently or adjusted her path with agile shifts. There were no slips, no hesitations. She completed the course as if it were routine. When the final siren sounded, Adrienne lowered the dummy onto the safety line, her legs steady, chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. She didn't sit down or tilt her face up to catch the breeze like many others might. Instead, she walked directly toward the group of officers taking notes, her gaze unflinching. The same officer who had whispered threats into her ear earlier, the bulky one who had loudly declared the rules, stood with arms crossed near the bench row, his awkward smile caught between arrogance and retreat. Adrienne stopped in front of him, with a stare as cold as ice and a voice dry as wind slicing across sand. She said, "If this is your standard, then I think this department needs a new scoreboard." Her words weren't loud, but they landed hard enough to make those nearby pause their writing, stop adjusting their watches, or halt mid-mation while peeling tape from scraped knees. The entire yard fell silent. The officer addressed didn't respond, only nodded faintly, as if clinging to the last thread of dignity. Adrienne didn't wait. She turned and walked away, each step firm on the gravel path, leaving clear tracks among the others. They'd hoped she would fall, but she didn't. They had backed her into a wall. She used it to rise. And when she disappeared behind the training ground gate, what remained wasn't just a performance score, but the first ripple of unease in the minds of those who once believed the rules here were unshakable. The complaint arrived in an unmarked envelope containing only 3 short lines printed by machine, the font sharp and cold. Racial discrimination is occurring inside the headquarters. Someone is manipulating shift schedules, hiding evidence, and endangering lives. Request internal investigation. The letter had been placed inside the suggestion box, located near the administrative office door. Known to only a few, and even fewer believed anything dropped into it could escape the control of those in power. The first person to receive it was the head of human resources. She glanced at it for a few seconds, pressed her lips together, then folded it and walked straight to the office of the administrative officer. Their conversation lasted less than a minute. No one else heard what was said. When she exited, the letter was gone, as if it had never existed. An hour later, the building's internal surveillance logs for that section were disabled due to scheduled maintenance. The letter was never escalated, never recorded in any file, and never logged into the suggestion box registry. It had been smothered from within. That afternoon, in the 3rd floor meeting room, 6 officers sat around a round table, all with over 10 years of service. The door was shut, blinds drawn. Coffee cups scattered across the table, and a printed copy of the intercepted letter at the center. The first to speak was Lieutenant Fraser, yellow patch on his sleeve, voice low and curt. "We've got a rat. Someone thinks they're clever enough to play anonymous games, but if they think they can outsmart this system, they're a damn fool." Another officer pulled out an unlit cigarette and turned sideways to ask, "Any suspects yet?" Fraser shook his head and smirked. "No need. Just send a small signal. Cowards like that will expose themselves." One officer tapped a finger against the table. "If we don't act fast, the rookies will start thinking they have real power." All eyes shifted to the end of the table, where Thompson, the shift captain, sat. He leaned back in his chair, fiddling with a silver ring, mouth curled like he was speaking in a bar, not a formal meeting. "I've said it. This precinct has a hierarchy. Anyone trying to climb by tattling better know one thing. Those who step out of rhythm will be crushed by the machine." Fraser nodded, pushed the letter to the center of the table. "I'll check hallway camera logs, see who stood near the box within 30 minutes before the letter appeared. It could be a coincidence, could not, but I want to know." Another officer chimed in, eyes flicking toward the small window. "If it's a woman, even easier. Whoever's been getting loud lately, she won't stay quiet long." The room chuckled. Not laughter of amusement, but the sound of people reaffirming that their grip on power remained intact, at least for now. Thompson tapped the table lightly, ending the meeting with a single line. "Whoever's behind this, they'll pay." Outside in the hallway, Adrian walked past that very room just as the door clicked shut. She didn't hear specifics, but the way they glanced at her on their way out, like measuring how much she already knew, made things painfully clear. The change in atmosphere didn't need to be voiced. When a system feels threatened, it contracts, tightens, and looks to silence. But what Fraser and Thompson didn't know was that the anonymous letter wasn't the only copy, and the person they were hunting wasn't nearly as alone as they thought. On the mezzanine floor behind the records hallway, where the electronic storage system sat beside the old administrative office, Adrienne sat in front of a blank screen, her fingers gliding lightly across lines of encoded text. She had accessed the document tracking system where all internal letters were scanned with an identification code before being uploaded to the main database. What she discovered was not within the content of the letters themselves, but in the access logs that had been deliberately deleted. While all other feedback submissions had clear trace codes and scanned timestamps, the one letter referring to discrimination that day had been altered, its final access log disappearing exactly 1 minute after the system initiated its scheduled maintenance. Adrienne extracted the recovery file using a private ID code assigned to the chief of police, something no one here knew she had access to. The supervisor badge on her chest was just a cover. Her true identity, along with her elevated access level, had remained hidden by design. Within 3 minutes of querying the database, a name appeared: Robert Kane, once head of the department's internal ethics review unit. He had since shifted into an advisory role in administrative tech, though he no longer held an official title. On paper, he had no decision-making authority, but every log entry pointed to him as the direct manipulator of document data, especially the anonymous letters. She saved all the data, made a separate copy, and hid it in an encrypted drive. That same afternoon, Adrienne entered the break room as usual, holding a cup of coffee, neither hurried nor watchful. She sat at a corner table near the water dispenser. Robert Kane stood by the window, leaning against a shelf, a cigarette unlit between his fingers, his eyes skimming over a text message on his phone. The room wasn't crowded, but there were enough people around that no one suspected a private exchange was about to unfold. Adrienne didn't speak right away. She waited until Kane looked up, his gaze lingering on her a second too long to be a coincidence. It was the kind of look someone gives when they know the other person has seen something, but they're unsure how much. She set her coffee down, her eyes locked on his, and said softly, "I came across a very interesting log. It seemed to exist right before someone deleted it, exactly when the system reported an error." Kane raised an eyebrow slightly, his movement of removing the cigarette from his mouth still slow and measured. "I don't know what you're referring to, and honestly, that sort of thing isn't within your scope of work." His voice was light, tinged with indifference, though it couldn't hide the guarded edge. Adrienne tilted her head slightly, her eyes unblinking. "It's exactly within my responsibility. Because when justice is twisted by deleted files, even the best typists like you will have to step into the light." She stood, walked toward him, and stopped just an arm's length away, close enough to observe the tiniest reactions. In that brief silence, she spoke clearly, each word deliberate. "Only those who fear justice fear a blank letter." A breeze slipped through the window crack, rustling the newspaper on the table. Kane said nothing, but his hand clenched slightly and his eyes turned away. It was the first time Adrienne saw clearly that the force behind the manipulated data wasn't some faceless system. It was a flesh-and-blood man, caught between fading power and the collapse, quietly approaching. That morning, when Adrienne walked into the locker room, the air felt unusually still. It wasn't the quiet of a sleepy morning, but the kind of silence that had been deliberately arranged. Whispering stopped the moment she appeared. A few glances flickered toward her, then quickly turned away, as if the entire room was pretending she had never existed. Her locker had been relocked. The name label on the bottom corner had been scratched off and replaced with a new piece of paper, scrawled in red ink, "Guest." Adrienne stood still for a few seconds, then turned away without asking for help. She walked straight to the workbench where personal items were usually kept. Her chair was buried in trash, food wrappers, crushed plastic cups, and a soggy meal box leaking sauce across the surface. A sour smell lingered in the air, enough to make anyone flinch. She grabbed the nearest trash bin and cleaned up each piece one by one, without question, without glancing at anyone in accusation. In the process, she found her pouch torn open, her internal ID card bent and broken through the center. Her pencil case was empty. The engraved metal pen she had used since joining the force was gone. The office carried on as if nothing had happened. Phones rang, papers passed between desks, footsteps echoed across the floor, but no one spoke to her. The only person who used to greet her in the early days, a young officer named Melissa, avoided Adrienne's eyes, as though an invisible line had been drawn between them. Adrienne didn't blame her. She understood the rules of this place. Silence was not just punishment. It was a warning broadcast beneath the surface of discipline. At noon, when Adrienne used her spare key to open her locker, a folded piece of paper fell out of inside. No name, no signature. Slanted handwriting in blue pen read, "Be careful. They don't want you alive by the end of this week." The thin sheet still held a faint fingerprint, and a smear of wet ink clung to the edge. No further explanation was needed. That single line confirmed what she had long suspected, now declared openly. Adrienne folded the note, tucked it into her inner pocket, and locked the door with a new padlock she had brought from home. The gesture was firm, leaving no room for anyone else to touch it. From that moment on, she expected no kindness. The game had entered a phase where the rules were rotting from the inside, where every filthy act was legitimized by collective silence. But she needed no allies. Every piece of trash, every broken locker, every nameless warning confirmed exactly who they feared the most. Not a rigid superior, but someone who would not bend even when pushed to the edges of isolation, and that was what kept them awake at night. The third-floor hallway was usually empty after lunch. Fluorescent lights flickered against the old tiles, reflecting faint, damp footprints. Adrienne was heading to the records room when heavy footsteps ahead made her stop. 3 men blocked the corridor, standing shoulder to shoulder like a wall of intimidation. All wore semi-formal uniforms, jackets unbuttoned, hands in pockets. Lieutenant Barnes, in the center, held an unopened juice bottle, spinning it lightly in his hand as if to set the rhythm for what he was about to say. "Funny," he started, not loudly, but just enough to bounce off the walls. "I thought a few trash tricks, lock swaps, and a busted chair would wake you up. Still stubborn, huh?" Adrienne didn't respond. She took one more step forward, eyes steady and level with the man facing her. Barnes leaned slightly, raising a shoulder, his voice cracking with thinly veiled frustration. "You want to lead here? You should talk to the ones who tried and disappeared. We don't need some leader dropping out of nowhere, especially not your kind. So keep going. Let's see how long you last." One of the 2 men standing beside him let out a faint laugh, tapping his fingers against his belt as if ready for confrontation. No one touched Adrienne, but their presence was unmistakable. A threat not spoken, but imposed by space, by blocking the hallway simply to send a message. She knew that kind of pressure. She had faced it before. In another unit where fear was masked behind performances of dominance, she stopped, standing exactly 1 arm's length from Barnes. She didn't back away or sidestep, just held her position as if she were the one giving orders in this frozen frame. Her gaze moved across each man, not harsh, not loud, but firm. "When you're done playing games, I'm ready for a grown-up conversation." The words came out light as air, not laced with defiance, not tinged with mockery, and that made them cut even deeper, like a dry blade through tension. Barnes clenched the water bottle in his hand, his throat twitching. The threats he had prepared dissolved inward because the person in front of him refused to play her part. She wasn't angry, didn't shove back, didn't utter anything that could be used against her later. She did the hardest thing. She stayed silent at the exact right moment, leaving the others to choke on their excess. Adrienne walked past him, her shoulder grazing lightly against Barnes, not avoiding contact. The 3 men didn't move. No one blocked her path again. The silence now carried a different weight. It was no longer a weapon of the dominant. It became a veil for their discomfort. As Adrienne disappeared behind the stairwell, one of the 2 turned to Barnes and hissed through his teeth, "She talks like that, and you let her walk?" But Barnes said nothing. He only looked down at the bottle in his hand, which had stopped spinning without him noticing. In another corner of the ground floor, Melissa hurried down the hallway, her eyes catching the scene from a distance. She hadn't heard Adrienne's words, but she had seen enough in their body language, in their eyes, in how the 3 men stood still like statues. Sometimes strength doesn't shout. It stands tall and speaks one sentence at the right time. And in that moment, Melissa believed that if change ever came to this place, it wouldn't be through pounding fists on desks, but through footsteps that kept their rhythm steady, even in the eye of a quiet storm. The second-floor meeting room was rarely this full. Chairs were packed closely, people filling 2 long rows, each wearing expressions that hovered between formality and curiosity. At the head table, Shift Chief Glenn sat in the center, hands clasped in front of him, as if preparing to deliver a well-rehearsed speech. After a few administrative remarks, his tone abruptly shifted. "There are individuals, though only here for a few weeks, who already believe they have the right to question orders, judge colleagues, and disrupt our internal order. We must address this clearly before the situation gets out of hand." His eyes locked onto Adrienne, though his words feigned neutrality. "I won't name names, but everyone here has seen the non-compliance, the refusal to follow orders, and the rumors that are disrupting our team. In an environment that demands discipline, what place is there for someone like that? A few heads nodded subtly. Whispers began to stir. Glenn pushed further. This city needs a united force, not a platform for someone to come in and act like they stand above the rest of us. Adrienne stood up. She walked toward the central podium, typically reserved for officers presenting reports. A breath of silence swept the room as if the air itself was holding still. She opened her document bag, pulled out a large envelope, and placed it on the table in front of Glenn. His eyes stalled at the red seal from the city oversight office, raised against the white paper. "Before you all continue discussing my position in this department," Adrienne said clearly, not loudly, but with a resonance that filled the room, "you should know I'm not here on probation, nor am I here to learn how to be a police officer from scratch." She opened the envelope and removed a sealed dossier. Holding the first page up to eye level for everyone to see, she read aloud, "Official appointment, Adrienne R. Blake. Title, Chief of City Police, term beginning on the 15th of this month, with full authority to audit, restructure, and oversee operations of all subordinate police forces." A stiff wave of silence rolled through every row of chairs. "The reason I've stayed silent until today," she continued, "was to witness everything for myself before implementing any changes. And what I've seen is not a professional force, but a group of individuals willing to destroy anyone they can't control." Glenn rose to his feet, face drained of color, lips parting as if to object, but no words came. Adrienne turned to him, handing over a second copy of the appointment. "This is the document for department heads and the city inspector. Starting today, I will personally review all shift reports, internal files, complaints, and any tampered data." There was no applause, no congratulations, but everyone understood. The mask of a trial period they had assigned her had fallen, replaced by a real title backed with authority they could no longer ignore. From that moment on, the game had changed. The air in the meeting room thickened, heavy like an odorless smoke. Every word Adrienne had spoken still echoed in the minds of many. The weight of Chief of City Police, not only silencing dissenters, but also shattering a mask that had long covered the face of this department. A few officers, seated near the head table, lowered their eyes to the documents before them, as if searching for something solid to cling to, anything to avoid the gaze now scanning the room, unflinching and unrelenting. Lieutenant Barnes, the one who once grabbed her collar at the station gate, was seated in the second row. His hands rested on his thighs, but his fingers were clenched so tightly the knuckles turned pale. His eyes blinked rapidly as if dust had gotten in them, though everyone knew it was a defense reflex, a way to avoid facing a truth that had arrived like an unannounced punishment. Glenn, the head of the meeting, had yet to sit down. He leaned one hand on the table's edge, as if trying to reclaim a stance of authority, but his body no longer held its usual steadiness. His lips were pressed together, and his gaze, unfocused, slid past Adrienne as if unsure how to respond. In the far left corner of the room, the young officer Melissa sat noticeably straighter than usual. Her eyes were fixed forward, unblinking, and for the first time since Adrienne had arrived at the station, that gaze held no trace of awkwardness or fear. It was a quiet light, not blazing, but clear enough to reveal a flicker of belief in a room too accustomed to the shadows of a broken system. Adrienne looked directly at each person, not rushing, not commanding, but offering no room for evasion. She didn't need to raise her voice or pound the table to demand attention, because the silence itself now stood as the clearest proof that her presence had carved a place deeper than any document ever could. When her eyes landed on the older officer who once said that one stain was enough to leave someone like her with no way back, he dropped his head and pretended to take notes, though the paper in front of him was still blank. "As of today," Adrienne began, her voice firm and clear, "your rules no longer apply here." The murmurs in the far right corner abruptly stopped. A young officer, mid-turn to whisper something to his colleague, seemed to swallow his words halfway. Adrienne's sentence needed no elaboration, no citation, because everything she had endured since the day she walked into this station had already served as the living evidence for what must be changed. She didn't stop there. Stepping closer to the main table, she opened the reform plan folder, a nearly 100-page document she had personally compiled over several weeks. Starting next week, all shift assignments will go through my direct approval, she continued, and all decisions regarding discipline, reassignment, or internal reviews will be audited according to federal standards, not personal opinion or the favoritism this place has long tolerated. To the right of the room, a group of 3 veteran officers, including one who once mocked that she was better suited for street sweeping, now sat closer together, their hands clasped beneath the table, shoulders shrinking as if trying to disappear under her gaze. They were used to dismissiveness, used to the safety of backroom support and casual mockery as unwritten law, but what stood before them now was something else entirely, someone who never bowed to intimidation and who, ironically, was the only one with the power to clean out this system. Adrienne closed the folder, finishing with a sentence not loud, but loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. I came here to give justice a voice, not to bargain with silence. No one clapped, but in that moment, not a single person dared to look away. The independent inspection team was formed early the following morning. Adrienne made no grand announcements and called no press conference. She simply issued an internal memo clearly listing the areas to be audited, the names of the team members, and a commitment that all oversight procedures would be fully recorded and securely handled. The memo was delivered to each personal mailbox and posted on the main lobby bulletin board, where no one could pretend not to see it. 12 people were selected, drawn from various departments, including some young recruits and a few who had remained silent in past meetings. Adrienne did not choose by rank, but by a single criterion: those whose names had never appeared in any negative report in the past 3 years. "I don't need experience that knows how to cover things up," she told the group in their first private meeting. "I need people who still have a sense of what's right and wrong." She asked them to start with the old archive of the Internal Affairs Complaints Division. For years, it had been treated as a dead zone, filled with hundreds of citizen and officer complaints, most of which had never received a response. In the dust-reel room with disorganized documents, Adrienne personally opened box after box. Some reports were missing signatures, others had no dates, and many included audio recordings that had never been properly extracted. As the first files came to light, names once familiar from power-drunk gatherings began resurfacing with a different tone. Lieutenant Barnes was suspended immediately after alterations were discovered in 5 complaint files linked to him. A senior officer, once in charge of night shift scheduling, was removed for violating transparency rules when it was found that 9 night shifts had been assigned to the same individual in 1 month. No one dared to speak out publicly, but the way old groups broke apart during lunch, the heavy silence in meetings and the eyes cast toward the chief's office whenever the door opened all revealed a growing fear. The loudest voices were now the quietest. Awkward handshakes replaced crude jokes. They knew the seats they had long sunk into by habit were no longer secure without real records to support them. As with all historic events, post-haze was handled, with little records to support them. Adrienne kept pressing forward, tracing each irregularity, highlighting every broken link. She did not need verbal remorse. All she needed was for the system to begin understanding the cost of negligence. In doing so, a small fire began spreading across the thick layers of records, lighting up places buried under years of silence. An internal message was sent at 4 o'clock that afternoon, a single short sentence that made even those used to enduring quietly stop and reread. Adrienne used no dramatic language and made no promises of redemption. She simply wrote, "If you've ever been pushed into the dark by abuse of power, my office will be open this week with full confidentiality and protection for those who speak." At the bottom was her signature, stamped in red, officially titled, "Chief of Police Adrienne R. Blake." No one expected such a message to trigger an earthquake. Yet within 24 hours, 4 people knocked on her office door. Two were recruits. One was from logistics, and the last was a female employee from the evidence control room. Each entered with cautious eyes and hesitant steps, as if carrying a past they had tried hard to bury. Adrienne recorded nothing, allowed no one else to be present during the talks. She simply listened, took notes in a private notebook, and ended each session with a brief "thank you." No promises, no long explanations. The first was Kyle, a logistics officer, who shared that last year he had been threatened for refusing to falsify ammunition distribution logs. The person behind it was a seasoned sergeant with deep ties to the internal investigation team. The second, a female officer named Elise, admitted she had been pressured to falsify a report in an unlawful arrest or else be reassigned to street emergency patrol as they threatened. Neither asked to have their honor restored. They simply wanted someone to acknowledge that what they had endured was not imagined. Adrienne didn't interrupt anyone. She let each frustration, each half-choked sentence come out fully, never rushing anyone to sign a confirmation. The only thing she ensured was that every piece of information was stored safely, encrypted, and separated from the internal system, with no one else granted access. She hired an independent security specialist to oversee the new storage network, installed multi-layered access permissions, and made sure she was the only one with the authority to unlock that file. That night, after the administrative building had gone dark, Adrienne remained in her office. No coffee, no background music, just a desk lamp casting direct light over every page of the files she was reviewing. Beneath the cold yellow glow, the scribbled handwriting, blurred scans, and hasty annotations came through clearer than any surveillance footage. Each line was a cross-section of a system long broken, one no one had dared to admit. Some names had been crossed out. Some lines were blacked over. Some case files had been sent, then vanished. Adrienne flipped through the pages, folded corners of those that needed verification, and wrote side notes beside unusual repetitions. She didn't blink for long, didn't lean back in her chair. Her reading rhythm was steady, her eyes sharp and swift. Each time she came across a buried case, she marked a red dot in the top right corner. By midnight, the final page was placed atop the stack, and her hand rested on it like placing a silent pause. There was no applause, no witnesses, but from that night on, Adrienne was no longer alone. Those who had stayed silent began to speak, and what they said began to be recorded as truths that no one could deny. The first gust of wind had touched the stone wall that had stood still for so many years, and she, alone in that lit room, had been the first to call it by name. Over the weekend, just as the tension at the police department seemed to have settled, a small group gathered in the old parking garage basement behind the technical wing. No invitations were sent, no notes recorded, but each person present knew exactly why they were there. Among them were Lieutenant Barnes, Deputy Captain Glenn, and several officers who had recently been suspended due to findings from the independent inspection team. They sat around an old wooden table in what used to be a maintenance room, now turned into a secretive meeting spot for shady discussions. The clinks of beer cans tapping together echoed faintly between glances filled with bitter resentment. "She didn't come here to work," Glenn said, his voice dry as sand. "She came to rip apart a structure that's lasted 10 years. Another chimed in, "As long as she's in that chair, we're all being watched like prisoners." The group nodded. No one suggested violence outright, but every sentence edged further into a shadowy realm of implication. Some began talking about creating internal pressure through rumor. They dug into Adrienne's old personnel files from her previous station, twisted meaningless details, and spread stories claiming she had once covered for suspects or that her appointment was politically engineered. Short paragraphs were rewritten, formatted into Word documents, and anonymously emailed to shared departmental inboxes. A few unattributed quotes began appearing on the internal bulletin board. "Those with a blemished past cannot represent pure justice. The chief is human, not a saint, and being black doesn't make her exempt." These weren't enough for formal accusations, but they stirred doubt among those already hesitant. On Monday morning, when Adrienne opened her office door, she found a folded piece of paper placed directly in the center of her desk. No envelope, no sender name. The text was printed in a standard font, no stylization, no spelling errors. "You can change your skin, but not your blood." She read it once, folded it back up, and placed it neatly in a drawer without revealing a single reaction. But that afternoon, when the inspection team arrived for their meeting, Adrienne issued a directive to audit the entire internal mail system, review access logs, and examine hallway surveillance from the past 48 hours. She didn't raise her voice or rally anyone. She simply wrote one sentence into the report: "Any act of intimidation or psychological pressure against staff involved in reform efforts shall be considered obstruction of official duty." The news spread quickly. Those who had found joy in the shadows began reevaluating their escape plans. Adrienne wasn't just someone holding a title. She knew where people stood, and she didn't overlook any trace, not even an unsigned piece of paper. An email was sent at 8 o'clock that morning, distributed across the department's internal network, titled simply, "About a Piece of Paper." No attachments, no images, just a short paragraph typed directly from Adrienne's computer and signed in full. I read the message sent to my office. The writer claimed that my blood couldn't change, as if skin color could taint justice. My response is simple. If my blood represents justice, I'm willing to shed it for the truth. Not for myself, but for those who were once forced into silence. The message spread fast. Within 10 minutes, the tech team printed and posted a copy on the main bulletin board. A young officer taped it inside their locker. A logistics employee snapped a photo and sent it to a friend at another department with the caption, "Our chief isn't ordinary." No one said a word aloud, but something had shifted. The crowd that once pretended to ignore her, once hesitated at every step Adrienne took, now began looking at her with different eyes. Many younger staff members, who had previously remained mere observers, now actively joined the records review team. A female officer who had once been threatened quietly submitted additional documents concerning past violations. The internal dispatch unit took initiative in reopening case lists with signs of irregular assignments. There were no shoulder pats to show support, no banners hanging high, but each small action made it clear that a shift was beginning to form, undeniable and steady. In meetings, the smirks that once greeted her entrance had disappeared. The mocking questions had noticeably dwindled. Shift schedules were no longer secretly rearranged. She didn't need to wield authority to suppress dissent. She simply continued to move at her own unshaken pace. Every morning, Adrienne was still the first to arrive, reviewing files thoroughly, approving assignments before leaving her office. Her consistency, composure, and unwavering adherence to principle did not instill fear. They forced others to confront how much they had once compromised. On the other side, the old factions began to fracture. Those who had once rallied loudly in closed-door meetings now drifted into avoidance. They no longer dared to criticize openly. Some requested department transfers. Others cited reasons for extended leave. Small acts of retaliation, like switching locker codes or leaking rumors, gradually faded. The manipulator behind it all, Lieutenant Glenn, began to find himself isolated by the very colleagues who once stood with him. No one wanted to be dragged into the upcoming audit. No one still believed that past power could shield current misconduct. Adrienne said nothing more. She allowed the system to recalibrate on its own. Those who stood by her sought no reward. All they needed to know was that this time, the truth wouldn't be tossed aside like old complaint forms. And in a quiet corner of the station, the printer continued to hum, releasing copy after copy, each page a marker of truth, slowly returning to light. The first summary report was sent out in the middle of the third week, over 200 pages long, listing in detail the cases that had been handled internally but never received a response, along with supporting evidence. Adrienne didn't hold a press conference. She sent it straight to the State Inspector General and simultaneously made the document public within the internal archive system, so that any staff member could read it. From that moment, the police department was no longer a place of silence. The names of those once considered untouchable began to surface, a series of cases involving tampering with evidence, erasing records, siphoning money from suspect holding accounts, and submitting contradictory proof were all identified. There were even instances of mid-ranking officers exploiting late shifts to manipulate staffing, forcing younger personnel to take their place, and then wiping the work hours. Adrienne didn't need to say much. She simply carried out the authority she had been given. The same hand, once yanked violently from a car, was now flipping through the department's history at a pace no one could match. Among the most prominent names, no one was surprised to see Glenn. Multiple schedule changes, signs of material embezzlement, and interference with complaint records all traced back to him, but direct evidence was still insufficient. Adrienne did not rush. She kept monitoring quietly, never confronting or trapping him. She simply allowed Glenn to step deeper into the world he had once built through habit and concealment. Then, on a midweek afternoon, after the inspection team received an internal recording submitted by a young officer in which Glenn admitted to orchestrating a plan to teach her a lesson, Adrienne officially ordered his suspension. Glenn was instructed to leave the office within 30 minutes and take his personal belongings. He said nothing at the time, only stood staring at the chief's door where she sat signing the suspension order. 30 minutes later he returned, knocked, and handed her a thin envelope. Inside was a single handwritten line. "I choose to step down, but I will not apologize." She set the note down and nodded. "Good. A man like you, no one needs your apology." That evening, Adrienne sat in her office, staring at the department's organizational chart, now with a large gap in the chain that was once thought irreplaceable. But from that void, she saw something more important. No system stands strong if built on silence and fear. Glenn was not the end. He was merely the first door to be opened, and she would not stop. Not while trust was beginning to return, not while justice had finally found a steady hand to keep it from being distorted. The meeting was arranged off the record. No boardroom, no secretary to transcribe. Just a small table in the old record storage room Adrienne had deliberately kept from the first round of reforms. The room was cold, windowless, with peeling paint on the walls. Glenn walked in, coat over his shoulder, eyes shifting as he tried to maintain composure. She was already seated, upright, both hands resting on the table, in front of her an unbound file. "You know why I called you here," Adrienne began, her voice slow but resolute. Glenn scoffed. "I'm no longer your officer, so this conversation, legally it's not required." "Correct," she nodded, "but morally it is. After what you've done, silence is no longer a respectable option. You may choose to say nothing, but I will be the final voice recorded in this file." Glenn leaned forward, planting both hands on the table. "I don't care what you write. What you're doing here won't last. There are still people out there who don't stand with you." Adrienne didn't respond, only pushed the folder toward him. "I don't need the outside to stand with me. I need the truth to stand with justice. And right here," she tapped lightly on the stack of papers, "are every single violation bearing your signature at the bottom." He opened it, flipped through a few pages. Irregular night shift assignments, a witness statement from a young officer, recovered text messages from a confiscated phone. Glenn stiffened, then laughed loudly, trying to cling to the last remnants of his old authority. But when his eyes landed on a photo from a private meeting with senior officers, captured by a maintenance camera no one knew was recording, the smile vanished. "I'm not going to jail over this petty crap," he muttered, his voice darkening. "You won't go to jail," Adrienne said calmly. "If you resign, sign the confession, and cut off all remote interference. If you walk away, I'll let you leave quietly. And if I don't," she looked him dead in the eye, unblinking, "then I'll let the people you trampled speak, one case at a time. You won't leave quietly. You'll be remembered as the face of a rot that finally got removed." The entire room went silent for 30 seconds. Glenn looked around as if searching for something to cling to, but There was nothing left. No more allies. No more corners to hide in. Just one reality. He had lost. He lowered his head, voice rough. "I'll sign, but I won't apologize." Adrian gave a slight nod, collecting the folder. "I don't need your apology. I need you to disappear the right way." 2 days later, the police department received Glenn's official resignation. No farewell event, no speech. Officers who once backed him quietly filed for leave or transfers. The backroom meeting chamber was sealed. Every old symbol that once upheld silent power began to collapse. Adrian didn't celebrate, didn't show her face. She simply returned to her office and flipped to the next page in her audit list. She felt no sense of victory, only the urgency of finishing a task, to uproot everything that had ever twisted justice inside the one place it was meant to be preserved. The cross-investigation began at the start of the 5th week, right after the storage system was fully re-encrypted under Adrian's direct control. Every suspended file, every irregular shift assignment, every handwritten note scribbled in meeting margins was dissected. No one could claim any more. I was just following orders. Silence, once used as a shield, has now become the most vivid proof of complicity. The internal inspection team was divided into 3 branches, each responsible for a different layer of documentation. But the most important part, Adrian handled herself. She didn't delegate the interrogations. Instead, she spent 3 sessions a day sitting face-to-face with every officer connected to unresolved cases from the past 3 years. No cameras, no recordings, just a notebook and a ballpoint pen on the table in front of her. On the first morning, Officer Raymond was called in. He had been on night shift when a duty reassignment record was forged, and he stood closest in the blurry footage of her being dragged from her car on day 1. He walked in with his head high, smiling like it was a formality. Adrienne didn't look up, just flipped open her notebook. "On the 14th of last month, you signed off on a shift swap between 2 people, but records show the other officer was on scheduled leave. Why?" Raymond blinked. "I remember clearly. Could have been an administrative oversight." Adrienne raised her head, her stare cutting into him. "And that oversight nearly cost a female officer her life. Is there a name worth covering up with a life?" Raymond went silent. She wrote a line, then closed the notebook. "I don't need your answer now. I just want you to understand that from this point on, every mistake will be written in blood if you intend to keep hiding." By noon, Officer Mallory stepped in. She had once shown some sympathy, but never spoken up. Adrienne didn't fault her silence, but neither did she excuse it. In specific circumstances, silence was no longer neutral. Last year, during supply distribution, 2 units reported missing inventory, but the log shows your signature. Would you like to see it? Mallory jolted. "I didn't sign that." "Maybe someone used my name. Did you report it?" "No. I thought if nothing was lost, it wasn't worth making a fuss." Adrienne paused for a moment, then said quietly, "What matters isn't the result, but how we accept it." She added another line to her notes, then closed them. "You have 3 days to resubmit a full declaration, including every time you saw something wrong and stayed quiet." By the end of the day, the justifications started to sound eerily similar. Everyone thought it wasn't serious, no one knew whose responsibility it was, and everyone had once wanted to speak but feared the fallout. Adrienne didn't react. She simply recorded it. She understood this department wasn't rotting because of one person. It had decayed from a habit of compromise, from silence dressed up as wisdom, from nods given when wrong was seen but ignored. That night in her office, Adrienne reviewed the list again. She circled the names not yet interviewed. Her eyes were solemn. Her face no longer cold but sharp, like a whetstone. She hadn't come here to make friends or seek approval. She came to strip away layers of deceit that had been allowed to fester too long. And even if she had to confront 50 liars in a row, she would still ask the 51st with the same steady voice. "When was the last time you saw wrong and said nothing?" The meeting room was more crowded than usual that morning. There had been no official invitation, no outlined agenda in the internal system, but everyone knew attendance was mandatory. laboratory. The air was thick, heavy like a vapor, pressing down on every waiting gaze. Adrian entered with a thin folder in hand, no assistant, no greetings, just a slight nod before sitting. The department chair's seat remained empty. She left it that way. When everyone had settled, no one spoke. Suddenly, someone stood up. The soft scrape of a chair against the floor made the entire room pause for a beat. It was Jordan, the youngest officer in the traffic investigation unit, and the one who had once slipped her a warning note inside her locker. He wasn't tall, didn't have an impressive track record, and had never spoken up in any meeting. But today, his voice rang clear. "I have something to say." He paused, eyes fixed on her. "I've known about some things for a while. I've witnessed unfair assignments, forced shifts, and words that crossed the line. But I stayed silent, out of fear, thinking that if I didn't speak, I wouldn't get pulled into it. I was wrong." No one interrupted. Not a single cough, not even the usual sighs of sarcasm. The entire room held only Jordan's voice. "I'm sorry for choosing safety over truth. I'm standing up today not to prove I'm brave, but to remind myself that if I say nothing now, I won't deserve to wear this uniform any longer." Adrian looked at him. No smile, no nod, no step forward to pat his shoulder like some might have expected. She simply opened the folder on the table, pulled out a violation report Jordan had submitted himself 1 week earlier. She held it up, her tone calm. "This is what I want to see. Honesty that comes unprompted, not dragged out. If you want to keep wearing this uniform, you need the courage to face the truth. Not once, but every day you wear the badge." Jordan nodded, saying nothing more. He sat down, without applause, without waiting for praise. But at that moment, another person leaned forward, as if ready to speak. Then a third. No one said anything out loud, but their expressions had changed. Fear was being pulled from its dark corner and replaced by something harsher, the light of truth. Adrian showed no emotion. She simply noted something in her book, then stood to end the meeting with one short sentence. "Starting today, if anyone has something to say, my office will be open every evening, and I'll be the last to leave this station until I know for sure there's nothing left here to hide." They did not give up. When old tactics stopped working, a group of conservative officers decided to play a bolder hand. They gathered quietly, no emails, no digital traces, just hushed talks by the parking lot, subtle nods exchanged in stairwells. Their sole objective, destroy Adrian's credibility from within by fabricating a misconduct case tied directly to her. The trap was elaborate. A box of evidence from a closed case was deliberately rediscovered in the old supply room with a mismatched signature verification. A forged report was prepared claiming Adrienne had abused her authority to erase traces to protect an old acquaintance. They even planned to send an anonymous complaint to city headquarters, using the name of someone retired years ago to avoid being traced. She received a copy of the report just hours after it was secretly printed. A young logistics officer had quietly slipped the paper into an envelope, delivered it to her office with a single line. "I'm not part of this, but I can't watch this department sink back into darkness." Adrienne read it, then immediately summoned 3 young investigators she had personally trained. They asked no questions, only awaited orders. She stated clearly, "We won't respond with words. We will use truth." The team split the work, reviewing the internal filing system, pulling storage footage timestamps, and cross-checking signatures on archived logs. One member found an infrared video showing 2 former officers sneaking into the evidence room, cutting the power for exactly 3 minutes to carry out the act. In the dim, grainy footage, their posture and movements were identifiable. They had forgotten that in this era, not all darkness remains unseen. That night, Adrienne didn't issue a warning or sound an alarm. She summoned the suspects to a small meeting room and played the footage on a large screen. When the moment came, when one of them was seen placing the fake file on the shelf, the room fell silent. Adrienne didn't shout. She stood, placed a responsibility notice on the table, and said, "You don't need to sign. I've already sent copies to Central Command. You each have 5 minutes to decide how your names will be written into this department's history." No one answered. One walked out first. The other 2 lowered their heads. Adrienne gathered the files, turned to her young investigators, and said firmly, "We are not here to befriend deceit. We must prove that justice, if not defended by fists, must be defended by intellect. That quiet counterstrike marked a turning point. She was no longer standing alone. Adrienne had begun to form real allies, those who believed in evidence and knew when to fight back. She did not win with authority, but with unwavering resolve against theatrics. And to her, the real battle had only just begun. On the second floor, the meeting room filled early. No one dared sit in the center seat, the chair of the executive lead, and now Adrienne's position. Avoided glances, darting eyes, all reflected the same thing: fear. The scent of paperwork and stale coffee mixed into a dense atmosphere that even seasoned interrogation room veterans could not shake off. When Adrienne entered, she carried no files, no projector, no lawyer, only a plain envelope and a pen. She took the center seat, laid the envelope on the table, and scanned the room, one face at a time. Everyone implicated was present, and they knew exactly why. Starting this morning, the police board will conduct an official hearing on the fabrication of evidence involving the current police chief, she said, without glancing at any notes, without raising her voice. I ask that every individual involved come forward before the investigative documents are made public. Silence stretched on for nearly a minute. One person tried to speak, but his hand trembled so badly he had to sit down. Adrienne didn't push. She simply opened the envelope and pulled out a verified copy of a video with confirmed legal origin, accompanied by sworn statements from the Independent Inspection Unit. At last, Lieutenant Douglas, the most senior member of the group, slowly stood. He didn't deny it. He simply sighed and said quietly, "I was involved. I let myself be drawn into what they called preserving tradition. But in truth, it was about preserving positions, preserving fear." He paused, looking at Adrienne, then turned to the whole room. "I'm ready to accept the highest form of disciplinary action." The first confession set off a chain reaction. The second, then the third, stood up. They made no excuses, offered no defenses. They knew everything was already too clear. By the end of the session, the confessions were signed, certified, sealed, and submitted to the disciplinary unit. 4 mid-level officers and 1 evidence room coordinator were suspended that same day. That afternoon, in the administrative office, Adrienne signed off on classifying the case under special violations in the department's archival records. It was the first time in over 10 years that the internal blacklist had been updated. Each line reflected a cut that the organization once tried to hide, but she didn't erase it, didn't cover it. On the contrary, she requested that the HR board publish it in the internal bulletin, along with a brief message: "We don't restore honor by forgetting mistakes, but by learning not to repeat them." The hallway that day was quieter than usual. There were no whispers, no familiar looks of contempt. A few even nodded as they passed her. Adrienne didn't respond. She walked straight back to her office, where a list of new audit team nominees already lay on her desk. This time, names of those who had once been pushed aside. She knew no single disciplinary act could fix an entire system, but this case had drawn a line. From now on, no one could say everything is fine when the truth said otherwise. Those who had once been controlled by silence had been unmasked, one by one. And if anyone still wished to continue, at the very least they now knew the second-floor meeting room would always have someone waiting, not to excuse the lie, but to cut it off at the root. Under the bright white lights of the ground-floor hall, the rows of seats once reserved for internal meetings were now repurposed. This space became the first public hearing room of the police department since Adrienne took office. Every corner had surveillance cameras, linked directly to screens in the break room, meeting rooms, and the internal communication system. Everyone in the department, from rookies to seasoned officers, was required to watch. There was no longer any room to look away. When the microphone turned on, the first to step forward was Ms. Mary Ann Hill, a former administrative employee who had been pushed out of her role after reporting a case of withheld evidence 5 years earlier. Her voice trembled, but remained clear, each word resonating. "I once believed that staying silent was how to protect myself, until that silence forced me out of the place I thought stood for justice." All eyes turned to her, but no longer with scorn. Some looked down, others turned away. Adrienne stood quietly in the back, not interrupting, not intervening, just listening. Next was Mr. Travis Glenn, a retired black police officer who had once been denied a promotion on the grounds of lacking leadership qualities. He carried an old file, faded papers, and a blurry photo taken with his former squad. "I used to teach 3 of the men sitting in that front row," he said, pointing to several mid-level officers. "I taught them how to process crime scenes, how to document properly, but someone else taught them how to step on honor to climb higher." The atmosphere in the hall grew dense. Each testimony was not just an emotional wound reopened, but a hammer striking the system's ingrained defense. Those who had once been cast aside, silenced, or reassigned without cause began to step forward one by one. No one could recover the years lost, but at the very least this time they were heard. Adrienne did not take the presiding seat. She chose to stand behind the recorder, personally capturing every word, every exchange, without skipping a line. To her, this hearing was not just about addressing misconduct, but about resurrecting memories buried in a system accustomed to silence and selective amnesia. At the end of the session, the coordinator announced, "The next hearing will be held in 48 hours. Anyone with information to disclose has the right to register." A sign-up sheet was passed around on the spot. In less than 5 minutes, 3 new names had been added. As Adrienne walked out of the hall, she moved slowly, locking eyes with everyone she passed. No one applauded, but the atmosphere had shifted. Silence no longer carried resentment, but became a space of waiting to listen, to repair, and to see whether, after this, justice would finally hold meaning beneath the roof of those who had once distorted it. The final list was posted with no footnotes, no explanations, just names and case numbers, yet everyone in the department knew exactly what each name had once done. Adrienne personally signed each suspension order, issued from her office with the seal of authority that no one dared question anymore. Among them was the white officer who had stopped her car on her first day, tapped his baton against the window as if waking a suspect, then yanked her from the driver's seat in broad daylight. He did not argue. He sat with his head bowed, face frozen, knowing there was nothing left to defend. Another was a former shift commander, the man who once declared, "If you're colored, stay quiet. If you're unknown, bow your head." He was also named in a closed-door meeting witnessed by city oversight representatives. Adrienne didn't raise her voice or revisit the past. She simply placed a red-marked file on the table and stated clearly, "A police chief is not someone who seeks revenge, but someone who cleans." One sentence was enough for everyone in the room to understand. The era of vague threats was over. Even those who once silently watched, who smirked when she was dragged across the floor, were not exempt. If there was misconduct, whether direct or indirect, it was cross-investigated and handled by the regulations. No gray areas, no exceptions. Every disciplinary decision was backed by specific evidence, kept confidential but ready to be disclosed when necessary. In an emergency meeting among city-level department heads, a senior oversight official stood to speak as Adrienne presented the final audit report. The gray-haired man, who had signed off on numerous questionable approvals in the past, unexpectedly asked to address the room. He spoke briefly. "I once stayed silent, once looked the other way, once voted yes, thinking it wasn't worth raising a fuss. But if my silence led to someone being humiliated at the gates of this institution, then I accept full responsibility." Adrienne neither requested his statement nor interrupted him. When he finished, no one clapped, but everyone stood. That same day, he was formally dismissed, right there in the session. No arguments. No one spoke in his defense. For Adrienne, justice wasn't about who bowed their head, it was about ensuring no one stood above the law. And in that system, if someone who once mocked the truth had to be removed, then someone who had once defended it, even with a single small act, deserved to remain. She did not do it to reclaim her dignity alone, but to show those who had once suffered in silence that justice never arrives too late if we are steadfast enough to wait for it. The new ethics training program was announced during a department-wide meeting. without prior notice or lengthy documentation. Adrienne stepped up to the podium holding a single A4 sheet. No logo, no elaborate heading like the outdated presentations they had memorized in the past. She simply said, "From today onward, every unit must undergo a mandatory retraining course on professional ethics. No exceptions, not even those wearing the badge of command." The room fell silent. The eyes that once held disdain had nowhere left to hide. The course taught no theory, showed no classic case studies. Instead, each person was required to read through old, forgotten case files and write their evaluations by hand, signing beneath every line. Each week, a closed-door sharing session was held in small groups, without leaders, without recordings. Adrienne had only one request: tell the story of what once made you choose silence. The change did not come from the powerful, but from the younger officers, who had only ever known how to bow their heads and follow orders. A second-year female officer, once ignored when she proposed reforming procedures for searching women, stood up for the first time in a general meeting. She recounted the feeling of being forced to follow a traditional protocol, even though she knew deep down it was wrong. Her story came without tears, without excuses. Just a plain account of the truth, read aloud before rows of seats that had once remained silent out of fear of backlash. From that day on, the closed circles inside the department began to fracture. After-house strategy meetings dissolved. Anonymous, threatening calls disappeared. Several fake internal accounts that had previously spread false rumors were identified and dealt with immediately, without the need for media involvement. Those who once believed they were a system within the system slowly realized that the old safeguards had been dismantled at the root. In the corner of the third-floor hallway, once a temporary smoking room where countless schemes were whispered, now hung a whiteboard with a line Adrienne had written in marker. "The code dies when truth is spoken." No one dared take it down. Some younger officers started posting small sticky notes beneath it, short, untitled stories that needed no names, and everyone reading them understood. Under the new leadership, internal reviews were no longer performed. All records had to be authentic and cross-hacked. Every month, a public accountability session was held between units, where anyone who violated the rules had to present their own mistakes. There was no more hiding. No one dared use seniority to cut others off. Adrienne never asked them to like her. She only wanted them to fear the one thing worth fearing: real consequences. And once they saw change as something they could live with, not something to fight against, then that change would outlive the one who started it. She did not need to be a hero. She needed a force that could reflect on itself. So next time, if someone was dragged from a car, everyone would know when to stop. The meeting began with a note taped to the common room door. All members are invited to attend a live Q&A session. No rank restrictions, every question is welcome. There were no loud slogans, no banners saying "for a fairer environment," just one line, one meeting room, and a single microphone at the center of a round table. Adrienne entered last, choosing a seat near the door, level with everyone else. She didn't make a speech. She looked around and said, "If anyone wants to speak, go ahead. I'm here to listen. No secretary, no outside oversight, just the department and the truth waiting to be heard." At first, the room was tense. A senior officer asked, "What if you're wrong? Who questions the leader?" Adrienne replied calmly, "If I'm wrong, I'll answer for it, and I'll be the first to resign." Eyes shifted. Someone nodded. A young Latino officer asked quietly, "That first day, when they pulled you out of the car, what did you feel?" Adrienne paused. "I didn't feel. I remembered." That was enough. Later, a young female patrol officer stood up. Her voice shook, but her words didn't. "You showed us how to stay whole. Thank you for making us believe we belong in this uniform." No applause, just a quiet acknowledgement. The room was changing. Afterward, no one called her chief anymore. They called her the one who holds the door, not because she controlled it, but because she stopped what once poured through it. Adrienne packed up the mic, left it on the table. The meeting ended not with claps, but with the silence of people finally heard, and one woman steady enough to carry the weight of justice without raising her voice. Just as the atmosphere at the police department began to stabilize after a series of major upheavals, a new scandal suddenly erupted, shaking everyone. An internal file was leaked, accusing a mid-level officer of accepting a bribe to cover up a case of civilian assault from the previous year, when the system was still controlled by the old group. At that moment, Adrian had just completed the first quarter reform report, ready to be submitted to the Department of Internal Affairs. But a message sent to the emergency inbox made her immediately suspend all schedules. She knew this was a new test, meant for a system learning to restart from scratch. Without being ordered, the young officers immediately convened an emergency meeting, reviewing all camera footage and duty logs. The first to discover the evidence was Lieutenant Velasquez, a newly appointed investigator who had been on the job for less than 3 months. He did not report privately to a superior, but immediately submitted the evidence to the entire investigative team. When asked why he was not afraid of retaliation, he simply replied, "We've been given a second chance to do it right. I'm not wasting it." No one laughed, and no one disagreed. They began handling the case as they had been newly trained, transparently, without compromise, and with zero tolerance for partial truths. Within just 2 days, the entire internal investigation process was restarted. There was no interference from outside, no need for media presence or directives from the city level. Department heads voluntarily turned in all relevant equipment and locked access to sensitive data to prevent tampering. Those who had once hesitated during hearings now actively approached the review board to submit additional evidence. Adrienne did not need to sit in the command room. She quietly walked the hallways, checking in on each team working on the case files. At each stop, she either nodded or silently observed. Once, when an officer asked, "What if the violator turns out to be a close friend?" she replied, "That question nearly rotted this department from within. From now on, anyone who places loyalty above justice should step out of the rank." By the 3rd day, the entire situation had been clarified. The officer at fault was temporarily suspended, and the file was forwarded to the disciplinary board without any intermediaries. Notably, the report bore the signatures of all investigative team members, a first in the department's history. No one sought recognition, no one gave speeches. But from that point on, a handwritten note appeared on the internal bulletin board, penned by the young officers. "We are no longer bystanders." Adrian stood before the note for several minutes, then walked away, taking nothing with her, because she knew that when the young dare to carry the flame of justice without needing to be told, that system has truly changed. And that, more than any verdict, was the strongest response to any scandal yet to come. In the following morning's meeting, Adrienne required the entire internal affairs team to report before the full staff. No one was allowed to be absent. She entered the meeting room on time, placed the file on the table, and her gaze showed no anger or outrage, only the cold composure of someone who no longer wished to hear excuses. "We once allowed silence to destroy the honor of this uniform. This time, everything will be made clear before anyone gets the chance to twist the truth," she said, her voice even, not raised, yet resonating through every gap between the rows of chairs. The directive was clear, no detail overlooked, everything to be recorded, archived, and made public on the internal system for all to track from start to finish. She did not want testimony, she wanted evidence. Every step of the investigation was assigned deadlines and independent oversight. Anyone who violated protocol would be held accountable not only in terms of performance, but also of professional ethics. Adrienne did not write new rules. She merely forced everyone to confront what they had once avoided. Within less than a week, the case was closed with a 35-page report, verified by the newly formed Oversight Board. The offender was suspended, stripped of all access and title. But more importantly, the way the system now operates transparently marked the real breakthrough. For the first time, from commanders to rookies, everyone saw that whistleblowing and investigation were no longer taboos. They were matters of survival. These changes no longer lived in papers or meeting rooms. Adrienne's name began appearing in internal training sessions, not as an appointed official, but as someone who had restored order amidst chaos. A group of young officers had even reprinted her first speech, the part where she said, "Justice begins with those who know when to be silent and dare to speak when needed," and posted it outside the break room. No one ordered it. They did it because they believed that if anyone could still represent the honor of the police force, it was her. Local media began referencing Adrienne's name as a model of firmness and clarity. There were no PR campaigns, no public outreach programs, only references to what she had done. From someone dragged out of a car like a suspect, she had become the one who showed the whole system how to step back from the brink of decay. In department-wide meetings, they began calling her the Unyielding Chief, an unofficial title that spread faster than any decree. Adrienne did not say much about it. She continued arriving at work on time, sipping coffee at the same small cafe near the station, walking past the old hallway where someone once dumped trash on her chair. Now that the chair was empty, no one dared repeat the past. And though there was no official commendation, she knew one thing. What she now held was worth more than any medal, trust that had once been lost, and won back through a quiet war deep enough to change the very system itself. On Monday morning, a fleet of federal plated cars stopped in front of the city police department. No sirens, no spectacle. Just gray suits, notebooks, and the watchful eyes of upper-level inspectors. They arrived unannounced, a common method for uncovering internal truth, but this time their silence as they moved through the halls felt different. Not cautious, but surprised. For 3 straight hours there were no raised voices, no condescending glances, and no officers stalling or avoiding. Every record was submitted on time, reports were clear and consistent, and past violations were archived with full documentation and disciplinary notes. The inspectors met with Adrienne for nearly 2 hours. No assistants, no transcription staff, just her, alone, facing 4 representatives of a system that once doubted her. One had even signed off on the hold of her personnel file during an anonymous complaint. But today, he took notes, quietly, asked only direct questions, and offered no sarcasm. When the session ended, no medals were handed out, no praises announced, just one brief line in the internal report. The organization has undergone clear structural reform, aligned with core responsibilities. To Adrienne, that wasn't a reward. The real reward lay in the data. Internal complaints had dropped nearly 80% in 3 months. Anonymous submissions declined, while reports filed by young officers increased, proof that they no longer feared backlash or stayed silent. The progress wasn't displayed on charts, but on handwritten notes pinned to bulletin boards. Unit C, Internal Complaint Resolved. Team 3, Ethics Protocol Updated. No signatures, no pressure, just quiet contributions rebuilding a system once deformed at its core. Even weekly shift meetings had changed. Sarcasm was gone. Seats weren't assigned by allegiance. Lockers stayed untouched. Younger staff asked questions, older ones admitted mistakes. Adrienne wasn't everywhere, but she was always where it mattered, at every handoff of values. Voluntary training sessions grew naturally. The headquarters, once split by division, now moved gently towards something it should have had all along: mutual respect. Not for her, but for the uniform, and those learning to honor it again. In the large assembly room, usually reserved for year-end summaries, there were no banners, no stage, no script, but every seat was filled, from rookies to former tactical leaders. No one was forced to attend. They came for one reason. Adrienne's name no longer stood for a title, but for something to hold on to. When she took the podium, there was no welcome music, but the room rose in unison and clapped, as if they had finally found pride in what they wore. She didn't read from a script. She didn't need to. Her voice was steady, simple, shaped not by performance, but by someone who had walked through fire. She spoke of late nights with unread files, of unanswered questions, of sidelong glances and traditions masking rot. Not with bitterness, but with clarity. Change, she said, doesn't start with forced agreement. It begins when people lift their heads from habit and face themselves. Then her eyes landed near the back row, where a white officer once known for public insults now stood, unprompted. "Chief," he said, voice hoarse but steady, "thank you for not giving up. If you had, we'd have had nothing left to hold on to. The last frost in the room cracked. The applause that followed wasn't for show, it was instinct. Adrian smiled faintly, said nothing, and bowed slowly, not to one man, but to a group that had chosen change. No flags waved. No plaques handed out, but everyone there understood something had shifted. Prejudice had been called out, power had been checked, and dignity was being restored through action, not symbols. The speech ended without slogans. No one rushed out, they lingered. As if to hold on to the moment, a new chapter quietly began, right in the place once marked by silence. And for the first time in years, the word chief rang out in that department, not as a title of rank, but as a recognition from those who had once stood in silence, now knowing where to stand. The year-end ceremony was held in a solemn atmosphere, but no one could forget what had been endured. When Adrienne stepped onto the stage to receive the Chief of the Year award, the entire hall fell silent for a few seconds, as if everyone needed time to realize the moment was real. A black woman, once dragged out of her car right in front of the department, was now being honored at the highest rank in the very place that had once tried every way to erase her presence. The award was not simply a recognition of personal achievement, but a testament to a system that had dared to confront itself. She did not read a prepared speech. Her voice was calm, clear. Justice is not for entertainment, nor for compromise with evil. Justice is for returning people to themselves. The statement was not directed at the crowd, but felt as if spoken to each individual, those who had once remained silent, once stood on the wrong side, once believed they could not change, and yet had chosen to begin again. There was no condemnation, no embellishment of achievements, just a reminder that all power must be measured by behavior, and any system can only endure if it puts people before what is merely called tradition. Adrian's story did not begin with a battle, but with a stance, refusing to back down. She did not come to lecture anyone, nor to seek revenge. She came to cleanse a system long accustomed to darkness, to clear a path for those who had once been forced to bow their heads. The transformation of the police department did not stem from a single meeting or directive, but from moments no one was required to take, yet they still chose to. A look held, a question dared, a decision made against old habits. More importantly, this story does not end with Adrienne. It continues in the young officers who witnessed and chose to stand on the right side, in those who once erred and dared to turn back, and in the very system that had cracked but learned to mend itself through transparency. True reform does not come from speeches, but from those willing to act, not for applause, but because they understand they cannot live another day standing on the wrong side. From someone once humiliated on the department steps, Adrienne had become a symbol, not of victory, but of non-compromise. She carried no slogans, aligned with no campaign. She simply did what needed to be done at the right time and the way conscience demanded, and that alone changed the entire game. When the ceremony ended and the lights dimmed, each person in the hall quietly stood. No one instructed them, no signal was given, but as if guided by something deep within, those who once spoke with contempt, who once shook hands to build a network of injustice, now stepped forward one by one. They offered no excuses, no evasions. Each bowed their heads, each bow a full stop to the years this department had been consumed by shadow. There was no need for indictments, no need for further accusations. Adrienne's presence and all she had consistently upheld made the truth they once hid impossible to ignore. From her first day, Adrienne stood alone. She was dragged from her car, stoned indirectly, with words and actions, assigned the most dangerous shifts, and trapped by hands long practiced in manipulation. They tried to force her out, using the whole system to see her fail. What they failed to anticipate was that she had not come to exist within that system, she had come to change it. Each word she spoke was aimed not at emotions, but at conscience. Each defiance was not to prove herself, but to awaken what those around her had lost: professional integrity. She chose not revenge, but confrontation, and with that unwavering stance, Adrienne stripped away every layer of bias, creating a new space where people could finally live by the true value of the badge, to protect and serve with justice. When the ceremony concluded, Adrienne did not linger on stage. She stepped down, unpinned her badge with the same calm as if she had never worn it as a symbol, but only held it as a temporary charge for the road ahead. There was no radiant smile, no need for applause. She quietly walked into the open air, her gaze fixed beyond the department, toward the places where justice had yet to be unearthed. And that is the greatest lesson this story leaves behind. Sometimes what is right does not need to be proven. It only needs someone determined enough to see it through. Adrienne was not a hero, but a mirror for anyone standing at a crossroads between closing their eyes for comfort or daring to face the truth to live right. And if someone once dragged from a car in the heat of noon could change an entire system, then everyone can do their part so long as they begin with the truth. As Adrienne stepped out of the hall, sunlight fell across the shoulder of her uniform, now without a badge, yet still bearing the full presence of someone who had pulled an entire system back from the edge of decay. She didn't need applause, nor did she need her name spoken, because this journey was far from over, and justice does not wait to be called before it begins to speak. She had done what many avoid, refused fear when standing alone, refused compromise in the face of wrongdoing, and refused to back down even when the whole room turned its back. The real question is not whether we can be like Adrienne, but when it's our turn, will we choose silence or will we choose to stand? What will you do when you see something wrong right in front of you?